Please join me in giving this Winfield, Kansas resident, Dr. David Nichols, a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
What an honor it is to be with this distinguished Pachyderm Club. I understand you were the 2016 Club of the Year in the United States. Yeah, I'm impressed, and at my age, I'm not easily impressed. That's marvelous. All of you have a handout on Eisenhower and McCarthy. That is not an outline of the talk. It's a supplemental information. It's got more on it than I even end up talking about, but it may be helpful to you in some ways because this is a very complicated story. For decades, my profession was not kind to Dwight Eisenhower. And then in 1962, a survey of historians ranked him 28th out of 34 presidents who had served to that point, 28th. In other words, he was deemed an incompetent president, a grandfatherly figure who would rather play golf than exercise presidential power. But now we know the truth, and the word is spreading. Recently, this last year, C-SPAN conducted a survey of 193 historians. The result, they now rank Ike fifth, only behind Lincoln, Washington, and the two Roosevelts. That is a sea change. And I've been privileged to play some role in that change. Addressing in particular Ike's alleged failure in leadership on African American rights, civil rights, and his confrontation of the red-baiting demagogue Joe McCarthy. So now to McCarthy. March 27, 1953, Dwight Eisenhower won a big victory over Senator Joe McCarthy. Ike's nominee for ambassador to the Soviet Union, Charles Bolin, was confirmed by the Senate 74-13 in spite of McCarthy's fierce opposition. And Ike grumbled to his aides that, quote, the only thing McCarthy wanted was headlines, and he did not care how he got them. McCarthy, this is Ike, McCarthy has the bug to run for the presidency in 1956, the president declared. Ike slapped his knee and thundered, the only reason I would consider running again would be to run against him. Knowing Eisenhower, he probably punctuated that declaration with what I would call a theologically incorrect expletive. You can figure that out. Flash forward to December 2nd, 1954. On that date, the United States Senate formally censured Joe McCarthy by a vote of 67-22. And after the censure, when McCarthy stood up to speak on the Senate floor, the chamber would empty. When the senator sat down with other senators in the Senate dining room, his colleagues would make lame excuses and leave. The bands of reporters who had once hung on his every word were gone. In short, he was a pariah. In late 1955, Army Counsel John G. Adams visited McCarthy at his home. They sat down and Joe poured 6 ounces of gin, not uncommon for Joe. He looked awful, Adams recalled. He had lost about 40 pounds and his hands shook. The gin trickled from the corners of his mouth when he took a sip. Adams described the man he left at the door as, quote, the cadaverous visage of McCarthyism, standing silently in the shadows, slowly dying. Indeed, Joe McCarthy did die. On May 2nd, 1957, he was only 48 years of age. That's a peek, folks, into a very complicated story. And if I confuse you in the next few minutes, all I can say is the book is a whole lot better than the speech. So I'll get the book, really. In terms of mystery stories, this is a howdunit, not a whodunit. In a whodunit, you know there's a crime, but you must follow the clues to find out who did it. In a howdunit, we know it's like the old Columbo series, some of you know. We know who did it, and the question is how and why. William Ewald wrote a book a generation ago with a whodunit title, Who Killed Joe McCarthy? Ewald's final conclusion was somewhat ambiguous. Mine is not. Dwight Eisenhower did it. Ike and trusted aides launched a clandestine operation designed to wrap a gay lovers scandal around the neck of a prestigious United States senator in the president's own party in an election year. That's about as tough as it gets in Washington. That is what the 1954 Army McCarthy hearings were about. Anybody here old enough to remember the Army McCarthy hearings? A few of you, or at least remember your parents talking about it. We'll talk about that later. A word about that lover scandal. The 1950s was a horrendously homophobic period. Just the rumor, not the fact, that a person was gay could cost them their job. It may sound strange to us now, but at that time it was widely believed, with some substance at that point, that homosexuals were security risks because the communists might blackmail them. Perhaps you've heard the traditional explanations for Joe McCarthy's demise. McCarthy, an alcoholic, did himself in, and he was damaged by Edward R. Murrow's legendary See It Now television program. During the Army McCarthy hearings, television unmasked McCarthy as the obnoxious bully he was. In this conventional version, the final nail in McCarthy's political coffin was that censure vote by the United States Senate. Now, those are all factors, but until now, we have not known, we've really not known that Dwight Eisenhower masterminded a secret campaign to discredit McCarthy. Now, if you doubt this, folks, I'm not a journalist and I'm not a pundit. If I can't prove something by means of a document or compelling circumstantial evidence, it's just not going to be in my book. And I can tell you, we can prove this. We have wrongly assumed that Ike was cowardly in his response to the senator refusing to use the bully pulpit against him. In fact, Ike worked to destroy the senator behind the scenes. John Adams, the Army counsel I mentioned before, observed once, quote, Eisenhower's indifference was deceptive. He could be in control while appearing to loaf. Who was Joe McCarthy? McCarthy represents what historian Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American politics. Such paranoia, Hofstadter contended, bubbles up about once every generation. Every generation, we get scared about something. In the 50s, it was communism. More recently, it's terrorism. More than a few pundits think that paranoid style resurfaced in 2016, but I'm not going to deal with that. And in any event, McCarthyism is a staple now in our political lexicon. On February 9th, 1950, Joe McCarthy delivered a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia. The senator announced that he had here in my hand the names of 205 communists in the United States State Department. Now, McCarthy did not really have those names. William Ewald writes that from Wheeling onward, though, McCarthy presided over a permanent floating press conference. Lights, cameras, microphones followed him everywhere. You talk about fake news. It's not new, folks. Joe McCarthy was doing it in the 50s. In 1953, due to Eisenhower's election, McCarthy acquired a new platform for his crusade. The Republicans had captured a one-vote majority in the Senate, and McCarthy became the chair of the Government Operations Committee and its permanent investigative subcommittee. In that capacity, the senators subpoenaed witnesses, conducted one-senator hearings, accused witnesses of guilt by association, and labeled as obviously communist anyone who dared to invoke the constitutional protections against self-incrimination. McCarthy hired Roy Cohn, C-O-H-N, a young legal prodigy, as his subcommittee's chief counsel. Now, Cohn insisted to McCarthy that he add G. David Schein, a handsome son of a wealthy New York family, as an unpaid chief consultant. Cohn and Schein's intimate relationship would eventually trigger the 1954 Army McCarthy hearings. Remember what I said about this being a homophobic period. There's just no doubt that these gentlemen were lovers. And it must be admitted that the Eisenhower administration subtly used that fact against them. Eisenhower sparred with McCarthy throughout 1953. The senator repeatedly opposed Eisenhower's key appointments, including in the wake of the death of Joseph Stalin, that appointment of Charles Bolin that I mentioned at the outset. McCarthy even got Greek ship owners to agree to cease delivering goods to communist China, an accord he had no authority to negotiate. He held hearings into alleged communist infiltration of the Voice of America and frightened librarians into American overseas libraries into removing books from their shelves. So the Eisenhower administration was accused of book burning. And McCarthy sent Roy Cohn and David Schein, labeled McCarthy by the news by McCarthy's scummy snoopers, on an investigative junket through Europe that tended to scandalize the entire continent. Now, despite those charges of book burning, Dwight Eisenhower hated censorship. And on June 14th, 1953, he spoke at commencement at Dartmouth College. Without mentioning McCarthy's name, the president urged, and I quote, "Don't join the book burners. Don't think you're going to conceal faults by concealing evidence that they ever existed. Don't be afraid to go into your library and read every book, as long as that document does not offend our own ideas of decency. How will we defeat communism unless we know what it is and what it teaches and why it does have such an appeal for men? Why are so many people swearing allegiance to it?" Dwight Eisenhower loathed Joe McCarthy. Still, he adamantly refused, and this is Ike's phrase, to get down in the gutter with McCarthy. In fact, Eisenhower refused to even mention McCarthy's name in public throughout his presidency. He never mentioned McCarthy's name. I couldn't find a single incident where he did. And his theory was that if he talked about him, it would just enhance his reputation. Harry Truman had gone after him by name a lot, and McCarthy had only gotten more powerful. Ike wrote a friend, "The President of the United States cannot afford to name names," he wrote. "Nothing would probably please McCarthy more than to get the publicity that would be generated by a public repudiation by the President." During 1953, Eisenhower had other pressing priorities than McCarthy. The nation was still at war in Korea. Now that has a modern ring, doesn't it? Which ended in July. The American people were still recovering from the traumas of depression in World War II. The Cold War with the Soviet Union had created a climate of fear that was the lifeblood of McCarthyism, especially the fear of subversion. In January 1954, McCarthy's prestige was at its zenith, with a Gallup Poll rating of 50% favorable, 29% unfavorable. But by 1954, Eisenhower had concluded that McCarthy was more than a nuisance. He was a threat to the president's foreign policy goals, to his legislative program, and to his party's and his own electoral prospects. Well, in August 1953, Joe McCarthy launched an assault on the United States Army, hunting communists in the Army, with a 5-star Army general in the White House. The previous month, David Schein, Roy Cohn's boyfriend, had been drafted into the Army, and Cohn launched a frantic campaign seeking an assignment that would keep Schein with McCarthy's subcommittee and with him. Constantly, Cohn harassed the Army, insisting that Schein be available for what was euphemistically labeled committee business on nights and weekends at a nearby hotel. Thwarted at every turn, Cohn angrily threatened to wreck the Army. In August 1953, at Cohn's behest, then, McCarthy launched these hearings looking for communists in the United States Army. That was in direct retaliation for the Army's refusal to give David Schein a special commission that would keep him with Cohn. McCarthy brutally harassed innocent people who testified before his subcommittee. In my book, I have much of the transcript of that first hearing on August 31st, 1953. The first witness was Doris Walters Powell, an innocent, frightened African-American clerical worker on maternity leave. And McCarthy's first words to her were, quote, "Let me say this, Mrs. Powell, we have information of Communist Party membership on your part." If you get a chance to get the book, you read that transcript of all this with great interest, I think. Well, Eisenhower, meanwhile, was busy behind the scenes. About the same time that David Schein got his draft notice, Ike called Fred Seaton in Nebraska. I don't know whether that name rings a bell. There are Seatons around here. One of my best friends is David Seaton, the publisher of the Winfield Traveler Courier. But Fred Seaton in Nebraska. The Setons were a newspaper family, came from Manhattan, just down the road from Ike's Abilene. Fred's father had been a secretary to Senator Joseph L. Bristow, who had endorsed Ike's application to West Point. In 1937, 2 decades after the Setons purchased the Manhattan Mercury, young Fred moved to Nebraska to become the publisher of the Hastings Daily Tribune. And upon the death of Nebraska Senator Kenneth Weary in 1951, the governor appointed Seton to that seat for a year, and in that year in the Senate, he developed a friendly relationship with Joe McCarthy, and then left to work on Eisenhower's 1952 campaign. So, in July 1953, the same month that David Schein was inducted in the Army, or received his draft notice, I should say, Ike asked Fred Seaton to take a redesigned assistant secretary position in the Defense Department. Seaton would serve as the Pentagon's liaison with the press and the Congress, and above all other things, he was to manage matters related to Joe McCarthy. Ike told Charles Wilson, the Secretary of Defense, that he had always looked at Seton, quote, as a reserve division, ready to go into action. That's the general's conception of this one man. McCarthy's hearings into alleged communist subversion in the Army continued for months. Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs that by January 1954, Joe McCarthy was riding high. Then came the turning point. On January 21st, 1954, Ike's top aides convened in the Attorney General's office. During that meeting, Army Counsel John Adams, who I've mentioned before, provided the details of McCarthy's and Cohn's repeated attempts to secure special privileges for David Schein. Chief of Staff Sherman Adams, no relationship, ordered John Adams to prepare a report. Adams sent the White House a stack of documents in mid-February, and the White House then returned those documents to Fred Seaton with secret presidential orders to edit them into a report for publication. Meanwhile, McCarthy continued his hearings on the Army. He harassed Irving Perez, a dentist drafted into the Army during the Korean War, who had invoked his constitutional rights rather than answer whether he'd ever been a member of the Communist Party. McCarthy branded Perez a communist and subpoenaed Perez's commanding general, Ralph W. Whittaker, for testimony. Now, Ralph Whittaker was one of Ike's boys, a hero of the war in Europe. And on February 18th, Joe McCarthy confronted Whittaker in what one author called a savage performance. Again and again, McCarthy pressed Whittaker for details about how Irving Perez got promoted and honorably discharged. Finally, McCarthy delivered the ultimate insult to this war hero. He charged that Whittaker was, quote, not fit to wear the uniform of the United States Army. Eisenhower, on vacation in California, was incensed when he heard about the attack on Whittaker. But as usual, he said nothing to the press. When Ike returned to Washington on February 24th, this is 6 days after that hearing, he did not know that Army Secretary Robert Stevens, that very day, had naively agreed to a secret luncheon with McCarthy and other Republicans on his subcommittee. Stevens intended to confront McCarthy and get a pledge from him not to abuse Whittaker in any more testimony or any other Army personnel. However, Stevens was just out of his league, and they talked him into signing an agreement that the newspapers the next day labeled a a surrender. And when Stevens arrived back at the Pentagon that afternoon, Fred Seaton bluntly told the secretary that, quote, he had been had. The next morning, the New York Times ran a devastating front page photograph of McCarthy whispering in Bob Stevens' ear. The newspapers also settled on another false conclusion. Again, fake news, folks. That because Eisenhower had arrived back at the White House the same day as Stevens' infamous lunch with McCarthy, the president must have ordered Stevens to surrender. That was false. Press Secretary James Haggerty described the president, quote, as very mad and getting fed up. That states it mildly. Dwight Eisenhower was having a full-blown presidential temper tantrum. And he thundered, Jim Haggerty's wonderful because he kept precise notes on his conversations with the president. And he said, inside his office, he didn't say this publicly, Ike said, this is my army. This guy McCarthy is going to get into trouble over this. I'm not going to take this one lying down. My friends tell me it won't be long in this army stuff before McCarthy starts using my name instead of Stevens. He's ambitious. He wants to be president. He's the last guy in the world who will ever get there if I have anything to say. And I'm confident those declarations were decorated, as I mentioned the earlier ones. Eisenhower ordered Stevens to the White House, accompanied by Fred Seaton. A team led by Richard Nixon drafted a statement for Stevens to issue repudiating the chicken lunch agreement. Ike himself edited that statement for 30 minutes, and Haggerty noted made it stronger. Stevens read the statement to the press, filled with the general's terse military language. I shall never accede to the abuse of Army personnel under any circumstances, including committee hearings, Stevens declared. I shall never accede to them being browbeaten or humiliated. And when Stevens finished that statement, James Haggerty rose and said, quote, on behalf of the president, he has seen the statement, he approves and endorses it 100%. From that moment on, the fat was in the fire. Fred Seaton and other key Pentagon people intensified their work in rewriting John Adams' report on McCarthy, Cohn, and Schein. And in early March, particularly on March 9th, 1954, the Eisenhower forces exploited two important events. That day, Republican Senator Ralph Flanders attacked Joe McCarthy in a speech on the floor of the United States Senate. He was a Republican senator, attacking another Republican senator. Excuse me. I cannot prove, but I suspect that the White House recruited Flanders to do that because he was very good friends with Sherman Adams, the Ike's chief of staff, and they'd had lunch the week before he did this speech. And Flanders, in that speech, asked a loaded question about Joe McCarthy. To what party does he belong? Flanders answered, one must conclude that his is a one-man party and its name is McCarthyism. Flanders concluded his speech with a sarcastic take on McCarthy's persecution of Irving Press, the dentist. He dons his war paint, Flanders said. He goes into his war dance. He emits his war hoops. He goes forth to battle and proudly returns with the scalp of a pink army dentist. Flanders had already sent a copy of his remarks to Eisenhower, who publicly commended them. That same evening, March 9th, Edward R. Murrow eloquently condemned McCarthy on his See It Now television program, and he included quotations from Flanders' speech. Murrow derided the senator as, quote, as a one-man committee who had demoralized the present State Department and leveled charges of conspiracy against the Army, including declaring that General Ralph Whittaker was unfit to serve. Murrow argued that, quote, the line between investigating and persecuting is a very fine one, and the junior senator from Wisconsin has stepped over it repeatedly. Merle closed with some comments of devastating arrogance. No, his political enemies would have said that. I misspoke. Devastating eloquence. Wow. Okay. I told you I was sick not so long ago. Okay. We will not walk in fear one of another. We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason. It is no time, Merle concluded, for people who oppose Senator McCarthy's methods to keep silent. We cannot, he declared, defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home. 2 days later, on March 11th, Fred Seaton released the 34-page report on the privileges McCarthy and Cohn had sought for David Schein. He released them on behalf of the Army, not the White House. Eisenhower, even in his memoirs, refused to acknowledge his role, saying only that the Army moved over to the attack. I did not mention Fred Seaton in those memoirs. Jim Haggerty confided about that report to his diary. It's a pip and shows constant pressure by Cohn to get Schein a soft Army job with Joe in and out of threats. Haggerty believed that report would bust things wide open, and it did. The result was a firestorm of controversy leading to the televised Army McCarthy hearings. And for 2 months, the American public watched as the McCarthys unmasked Joe McCarthy for who he really was. For 2 months, any of you old enough to remember how many networks we had in those days? 3. Yeah, we didn't have the kind of choices we have now, did we? So at least one of the networks did gavel-to-gavel coverage. And so people ate it up. You know, remember, television was pretty new. On the farm I lived on, we didn't even have one. There was so much drama in those 2 months, I can cite only 2 episodes. But there's more in the book. In May, the hearings erupted in demands by both parties for testimony about that January 21st meeting at which Eisenhower forces had first examined the McCarthy-Cohn-Schein relationship. Ike refused to allow his personal advisors to be subpoenaed and unmask his own involvement. So on May 17th, Eisenhower invoked executive privilege. You hear that term quite a bit these days, citing historic precedent for the protection of presidential advisors. In response, McCarthy challenged government employees to disobey their superiors and report directly to him because, quote, their oath to protect and defend this country against all enemies, foreign and domestic, is a commitment that towers far above any presidential secret orders. Eisenhower shot down McCarthy's tirade with a statement issued under the name of the Attorney General. That was typical of Ike being so secretive. But then he called his press secretary, Jim Haggerty, into the Oval Office and vented his rage at, quote, the complete arrogance of McCarthy. Pacing behind his desk, Eisenhower thundered that McCarthy's challenge to federal employees to disobey their superiors, quote, amounts to nothing but a wholesale subversion of public service. McCarthy, he barked, is making exactly the same plea of loyalty to him that Hitler made to the German people. Both tried to set up personal loyalty within the government, while both were using the pretense of fighting communism. McCarthy is trying deliberately to subvert the people we have in government, people who are sworn to obey the law, the Constitution, and their superior officers. I think, this is Eisenhower, I think this is the most disloyal act we have ever had by anyone in the government of the United States, unquote. The Army's attorney was a man named Joe Welch, may be familiar to you. And he had a confrontation with McCarthy on June 9th, 1954. McCarthy charged that Welch had in his law firm a young man named Fred Fisher who had once been associated with allegedly pro-communist organizations. A hush fell over the room when McCarthy hurled that accusation, and Welch sat with his head in his hands, staring at the table. Then he addressed the hearing chairman, Carl Munt. Mr. Chairman, under these circumstances, I must have something approaching a personal privilege. McCarthy was pacing about, ordering aides to retrieve the file on Fred Fisher. Welch repeatedly tried to get McCarthy's attention, without success. Finally, he declared, "Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Fred Fisher is a Harvard Law graduate whom Welch believed was starting what looks to be a brilliant career with us. Little did I dream," Welch continued, "you would be so reckless and cruel as to do an injury to that lad. I fear he shall always bear a scar needlessly inflicted by you. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so, but your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me." But McCarthy resumed his attack on Fisher, and Welch interrupted in a commanding voice. "Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You have done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" That's the famous phrase from Joe Welch. That was on television. By the way, some of these hearings, you can go online and find them. By the time the hearings ended the following week, McCarthy was upside down in the polls. In July 1954, Roy Cohn resigned to return to his New York law practice and eventually became the lead attorney and mentor for 13 years to a man named Donald Trump. But that's another story. That's not my story. McCarthy's senatorial colleagues censured him by a vote, as you know, of 67 to 22. 2 days later, Eisenhower invited Senator Arthur Watkins, the chair of the censure committee, to the White House. Afterward, the president issued a statement commending Watkins for, quote, "a very splendid job of managing the censure process." That was more than Joe McCarthy could take. On December 7th, he walked into the first hearing of his subcommittee in months and delivered a statement in which he publicly apologized to the American people for ever supporting Dwight Eisenhower for president. But the political war was over. In a June 1955 meeting, Eisenhower repeated a joke that was making the rounds in Washington. "It's no longer McCarthyism," the president said. "It's McCarthyism." Eisenhower finally emerged publicly from his self-imposed silence in an article written for the Reader's Digest just prior to his death. Ike, using a pencil, edited out his harshest criticisms. I'm sorry I can't share those with you, but I've seen them. Still, he could not resist in the final version saying, quote, "What a lot of people even today don't know is that behind the scenes, I was doing all I could to assist those who were wrongly accused. And in many cases, my efforts were effective." Eisenhower recalled that once the struggle with McCarthy was over, a former aide and critic of his approach to McCarthy came and said to him, "By gosh, Mr. President, you were right about McCarthy." And a smiling Eisenhower responded, "Sometimes I am." Dwight D. Eisenhower died on March 28, 1969. His article, "We Must Avoid the Perils of Extremism," was published the following month. And for all his editing, Dwight Eisenhower had finally, publicly denounced Joe McCarthy. Thank you. That's all I have to share, but I welcome some questions if you have some.
I'd like to thank you for being here. In Jennifer's absence, I'll be carrying the mic around. Please observe the typical decorum of asking a brief question, and we'll start with members first. Have our first name.
Thank you. Could you address Whittaker Chambers, Albert Hiss, and the government?
I am
Comments of the government.
not well, sir. I'm not expert on that. The Whittaker Chambers thing came up, I believe, starting in 1948. It came up prior to the Eisenhower administration. So I'm not very conversant with that. I apologize to you, but I try not to talk about, pontificate about stuff I don't know much about. You know, I know about Chambers, certainly.
And Albert Hiss was in the government.
Yeah, and Albert Hiss was eventually prosecuted for perjury. You know, and Richard Nixon was deeply involved with that. And I'm sorry I don't know more detail about it. Was there something behind your question?
He was a communist.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, well, Chambers had been, yes, right.
Well, they knew they were exploiting people in the government who were communists.
Yeah, right. And it was a real thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a real thing. One of the problems with all right, thank you, because that clarifies an important issue. There were, in fact, and we have research to show it, communists in the government, spies in the government. There were. There's just no evidence that Joe McCarthy ever caught one. But there were. And the Eisenhower administration, in much more detail in the book than I've been able to share here, actually worked on that. And were careful about, they washed a lot of people out of the government they thought were suspect. Unfortunately, a lot of them were also gay people that they just thought could be prosecuted, or allegedly gay people. But the Eisenhower administration was not placid about that. So if that's your point, yeah. There were, and we had spies in Moscow, I'm confident, too.
Yeah, sir, there's always two sides to every story. Motive, not the motive. It sounds as if Congress may have been McCarthy's enabler, and let's go with the motive on that, to whip up anti-Russian communist fervor in this country. All those white-haired senators, and McCarthy so young, they could have stopped him in his tracks rather quickly. Something doesn't add up there.
Well, he was very prestigious. He was arguably, I mentioned that Gallup poll to you, where he had 50 to 29% approval. He was quite prestigious. And when he became chair of the committee in '53, McCarthy had 8 to 12 senators who would vote with him regularly. So he didn't have a majority. But that could block a lot of things if you know how Congress works and how the Senate works particularly. And in those days, the filibuster required 67 votes, I think, to get legislation passed. So he was powerful, and of course you're correct, they could have, and eventually they did turn on him. But only after television kind of really destroyed his reputation. But when we get scared, demagogues can thrive. And that's always been true, and it's been true a number of times in our history. Thank you for that good question.
Next question right here.
So thanks for joining us. Do you know what eventually happened to Joseph McCarthy?
Well, he died in 1957.
In office?
No, well, yeah, he was still senator, yes. So he died. The obituary said it was hepatitis. We suspect it was cirrhosis of the liver, but that's never been proven. But he was an alcoholic. There's no question. This guy couldn't get through the day without a number of shots of whiskey. But 1957 at the age of 48.
Next question.
Hi, I'm sorry to be negative as usual here. You've given the impression that McCarthy was so evil and that Eisenhower did a great service, although in the background helping to bring down this evil demagogue, blah, 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 blah. That's what everyone thinks because we've had 50 years of that. In fact, you mentioned Trump. Isn't there a lot of...
It happens to be the truth, but go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Well, then let's have a free market idea about that. By your own admission, Eisenhower was a sneak, a weasel, a liar, and a phony until it became safe for him not to be. And talking about Trump, isn't this a lot like what McCarthy like with Trump? The establishment, both Republican and Democrat, and the media, Edward R. Murrow and those other great, courageous people, ganged up on McCarthy. And a lot of the things McCarthy said, yes, he had faults, were true. He identified people that were communists. Eisenhower and his administration ordered the army to shut up and not cooperate. And the New York Times liked that then. They didn't like it so much later. So your presentation, you're really appealing to the ignorance of people who have this cartoon idea of McCarthy, and therefore
Well, sir, I respect you. I respect your point of view, but ignorance, appealing to ignorance, is not my business. This is factual research. It's not invented. If you want to argue that Eisenhower was secretive, he certainly was. I have no question about that. And you still can be my guest if you can find me any documentary evidence that Joe McCarthy ever identified as a legitimate communist. But no, it's just the fact, and this is not an invented story. It's not propaganda. I promise you, it's not. If you really knew my whole history, I was not an Eisenhower fan when I started this research, not at all. And so, I'm sorry, but we just have to agree to disagree.
We've got our next question over this.
Professor
Oh,
Nichols.
okay. Yes, sir.
It's an interesting historical footnote. Two quick points I'd like you to comment on, please. Of the 22 senators who voted against the censure of Senator McCarthy, John F. Kennedy, a young senator from Massachusetts, was one of those senators, and I would be interested in your...
He was actually in the hospital at that time.
He did not actually vote?
He did not vote.
Oh.
He was in the
I've
hospital.
seen some reports that he did.
However, the Kennedy family was very cozy with McCarthy, but that's a long story.
Okay, well then, appreciate the clarification. Second point, declassification of documents and for a historical record has got to be very important. And the Venona papers came out probably about 15 years ago with a great deal of information and pointed out, like you said, that Harry Dexter, wow, there are a number of
Harry Dexter White probably wasn't.
White, Alger Hiss, a number of these folks were indeed Soviet agents.
Yeah, the Harry Dexter White story is in my book.
It goes back to FDR and Truman preceding Eisenhower. Is there more historical data that's going to come out? And can anybody really do a discussion of this period in American history without getting their hands on the documents like the Venona papers and being able to, I mean, there are books out now like The Battle of Bretton Woods concerning John Maynard Keynes, and interestingly enough, Harry Dexter White, that basically set the stage for the entire post-war economic system. And these new documents obviously would have an impact on what the real history of the real events
Well,
are.
I've been through the most recent documents. Now, they're always declassifying documents, although a whole lot have been declassified. I might tell you quickly that story. Where's my timekeeper? Are you? Yeah, okay. Fred Seaton, actually, during the Army McCarthy hearings, talking about classified documents, Eisenhower ordered Fred Seaton to collect every single McCarthy-related document in the Pentagon, collect them, and keep them. So there were phone transcripts. They didn't record in those days, but they had a transcriber listening and writing it down. You had letters, memoranda, all that. Seaton collected all those, probably over 10,000 pages. And he locked them up and kept them. And when he became Secretary of the Interior, he took those documents with him to the Secretary of the Interior. Bill Ewald, the author I mentioned, used to worked at Interior for Seton, and he said Seton would point at the locked file cabinet and say, "I'll never open that until you know who tells me to." And then Seton actually took those documents home with him to Nebraska when he went back to rejoin the newspaper industry. And when Seton died, they finally came to the Eisenhower Library. I've been through almost every page of those documents. Plus, as you mentioned, sir, a lot of declassified documents. I don't know about the particular collection you're mentioning, but there's been a lot of them. And I think most of them for this period have now been declassified, but there may be some that have not.
You have another question, Art?
Yes, sir.
David, thank you very much for speaking at the Pachyderm Club. We appreciate your time, and we appreciate your research, too. I don't know everything about McCarthy, but I did read a piece about that reflected Ronald Reagan during the time he was president of the Hollywood actors, and McCarthy had a whole list of movie actors that he was sure that were on the wrong side of history. And could you expand a little bit on that part of it and tie it in with Ronald Reagan any way you can?
Yeah, I'm limited, I limited this primarily to the Eisenhower administration, but McCarthy, in my research, didn't go after Hollywood people very much. He went after government people. But the blacklisting of Hollywood actors and writers and all that had happened even before he became prominent with the House Un-American Activities Committee, on which Richard Nixon served, and the HUAC, as it's known for short, did an awful lot of that, and that was from 1947 onward. And some of that, by the way, continued after McCarthy's death. And it would be false to pretend it was all McCarthy. It was not. But he focused primarily on communists in government, in my experience, and I didn't find much evidence that he talked much about the Hollywood thing. He did some, but it was marginal to what he was doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question.
Well, this will be the last question. When you were here before, you expounded on Eisenhower's leadership style. Can you give us a little bit of a summary of
Well, Eisenhower's leadership style is what one author called the hidden hand presidency. Certainly it was, and as the one gentleman raised, he was sneaky. He was. Deception was in his bones, and you got to remember, this is the general who, working with the Allies, fooled the German general staff about where and when the largest military armada in human history would land in France. So he knew about deception, and he used it. And they really debate about presidential leadership because he could be faulted for not being a good public educator. He just didn't believe much in using the bully pulpit. And we modern people are sure if the president doesn't use the bully pulpit, if he doesn't speak out, he or she, then somehow they're not doing their job. Ike did not see his job that way. So he was secretive. He was thoroughly strategic. He had, the legend in the early years was that he wasn't in charge of his presidency. On the contrary, all those people who worked for him, and that's true in the McCarthy thing, key subordinates didn't do a speech without clearing it with Eisenhower. They worked under orders. He was a general, but he would fool people, and his leadership style and fooling the press even, famous story that he says to Jim Haggerty. Jim Haggerty warns him, and he's about to go into a news conference, and he said, "Mr. President, they're really going to give you trouble on this particular issue." And he said, "Don't worry, Jim, I'll just confuse them." And he did. The guy did 292 press conferences, almost one a week. So he talked a lot. But he would get into what one author called a fog of words. When he didn't want to reveal something, he could be quite precise when he wanted to. So it is a fascinating thing, John, about this secretive approach. And you could certainly argue that the American people didn't get to vote on McCarthy's demise, and that there's something pretty left-handed about it in a whole lot of ways. But having said that, I don't, as I said to my friend over here, I don't apologize for that. I think Joe McCarthy was not a plus for the American system. He was a demagogue. He was more after headlines than anything else. And I think that's been proven beyond doubt. But there are a few authors around who still defend him as being a very good guy. Okay, thank you so much.
One other quick thing. You mentioned when you were here before that Eisenhower brought the Army Chief of Staff model to the White House. Would you talk about that?
Yes. Well, I'm still working on that some. If I do another book, I may get more deeply into it. But yeah, he labeled it. He said he was bringing a staff system. In a staff system meant he had some people assigned to major issues and others assigned to other major issues. And they sometimes didn't know what the other one was doing, but Ike knew. And he checked with them very carefully. He was a master at delegating. That particularly came out of his staff system. That Eisenhower understood what most of us who are in the business world don't understand well enough, how you delegate effectively. Because if you delegate a task to somebody, you're going to get maybe, if you're lucky, 75% of what you wanted. And so he would brief them at the outset, check up on them, and debrief them later. He was very rigorous about that, and seeing to it that they didn't, poor Herbert Brownell, he on a speech that Brownell was doing, Ike just continued to micromanage that and to edit it right down to the last minute. So he was very much in charge of those people. So this was a general's staff.
Was he the first one that brought the Chief of Staff system to the White House?
Well, I would say so. I don't know what General Grant did, and he's the other general president. That's out of my wheelhouse. So thank you. You've been very kind.